And all of this looks like a lot more deaths in a lot younger people than is normal. And it seems to be especially showing up in athletes, people who really push their heart rates up when they're exercising. A German news site actually put together a list of over 75 known cases of athletes collapsing and even dying in the last 5 months. The link is here, and you can check it out in the PDF version of this presentation. And an Israeli news site analyzed the number of sudden deaths on the pitch or in mid-play of members of the International Football Association, FIFA. Over the past 20 years, the average number of FIFA sudden deaths on the pitch was 4.2 per year. But in 2021, there were actually 21 deaths, 5 times the normal average. These incidents are supposed to be rare, and we can't ignore that they no longer are.
High school senior is in the hospital after collapsing on the tennis courts.
Breaking new details on the deaths of a high school soccer player.
Finland, Denmark star man Christian Eriksen collapsing towards the end of the first half.
A South Carolina high school football player has died after collapsing at football practice. Star college basketball player collapsing on the court. We want to warn you, the video may be difficult to watch.
That video actually goes on much longer. We've included the link in our PDF if you'd like to watch the full video. On November 17th, 2021, the FDA released the first batch of what will ultimately be over 300,000 pages that they were ordered by a court to provide to satisfy a Freedom of Information request by a group called Public Health and Medical Professionals for Transparency, who wanted access to the data used by the FDA to approve Pfizer's COVID-19 inoculations. Now, the FDA didn't actually want to give it to them, and they've asked the court to give them 50 years to release the documents. And it's easy to see why. Because the post-marketing pharmacovigilance report submitted to the FDA, where Pfizer tracked real-world events occurring in the first 2.5 months of the rollout, was extremely disturbing. In the first 2.5 months, there were over 1,200 deaths. There were over 25,000 nervous system adverse events. Under safety concerns, Pfizer listed anaphylaxis and vaccine-associated enhanced disease. This document alone should be incriminating for any agency who saw it and called these inoculations safe. Now let's get to the considerable evidence of conflict of interest. Pfizer is making billions, over $33 billion in 2021 alone, and probably much more than that at this point. When the incentive is such an astronomical sum of money, it only makes sense to ensure rigorous oversight of the process and as many safeguards as possible are in place. Because their agenda is not the same as ours. Their agenda is their shareholders and their bottom line, not public health. And anyone looking at Pfizer's history would know that caution is warranted, because over the years, Pfizer has been found to have engaged in many spurious and criminal activities, including lying to get federal approval for a heart valve that fractured and killed hundreds of patients worldwide, conducting clinical trials on African children without their parents' consent, after which some of the children died, bribing doctors, suppressing research, manipulating studies, withholding information that its products caused cancer, fraudulent marketing, and many more. They've paid billions, actual billions in fines and settlements for their actions. And if you want to read the details for yourselves, you can check out these links on the PDF version of the presentation. Now, nowhere is Pfizer's conflict of interest more apparent than in the authors of its reports. Using the 6-month report as an example, you can see that 84% of the study authors have conflicts. So they're either employed by Pfizer, or they have employment and stock with Pfizer, or they've gotten grants from Pfizer, or they've been hired as consultants by Pfizer, or they've run clinical trials for Pfizer. In terms of the people who didn't have conflicts, there were only 5, and they don't represent any of the main authors. The leading author, the corresponding author, and the last author all have conflicts of interest. The most eye-popping example of conflict is the 2 founders of BioNTech, who are a husband-wife team, and who are also the Pfizer inoculations for COVID-19 and why they do more harm than good. We're the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, and our alliance of over 500 independent Canadian doctors, scientists, and healthcare practitioners is committed to providing quality, balanced, evidence-based information to the Canadian public about COVID-19 so that hospitalizations can be reduced, lives saved, and our country safely restored to normal as quickly as possible. We support the doctor-patient relationship and personalized care, informed consent and treatment options, free and open scientific discourse, and safe and effective vaccines. We'll begin with the most important premise in medicine. First, do no harm. The federal, provincial, and municipal governments in Canada have a responsibility to protect the health of Canadians as well as our charter rights and freedoms. Any medical interventions approved by Health Canada must first be proven safe. Due diligence and research, as well as adherence to the established protocols of the doctor-patient relationship, informed consent, and scientific inquiry are essential to carrying out that responsibility. Deviating from those practices, causing harm, and failing to disclose risks of harm is negligent at best. It's important to understand the hierarchy of scientific evidence. When you're talking about proving things to be either safe or harmful, you need to rely on the best evidence. As you can see from the table on the right, a randomized control trial is level 1 evidence, the highest form of evidence there is. It's considered the gold standard, and it's the only way to prove that something is true. Models, which we've heard a lot of during the pandemic, are actually the lowest form of evidence, level 5 or lower, as they're considered to be expert opinion or speculation. Policy should always be determined by the highest level of evidence available, which is level 1. So first, we're going to talk about Pfizer's original trial report that came out in December 31st of 2020. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it showed 2 months' worth of safety and efficacy data. It described how the trial started, with over 43,000 people divided into a treatment group and a control group, and how for 2 months they followed them to see who developed COVID-19. The report claimed that the inoculations were safe and showed 95% efficacy 7 days after the second dose. But that 95% was actually relative risk reduction. Absolute risk reduction was only 0.84%. Many people don't know the difference between relative and absolute risk reduction, so we're just going to show you what that means. Pfizer reported that its vaccine shows a 95% efficacy. That sounds like it protects you 95% of the time, right? But that's not actually what that number means. That 95% refers to the relative risk reduction, but it doesn't tell you how much your overall risk is reduced by vaccination. For that, we need absolute risk reduction. In the Pfizer trial, 8 out of 18,198 people who were given the vaccine developed COVID-19. In the unvaccinated placebo group, 162 people got it, which means that even without the vaccine, the risk of contracting COVID-19 was extremely low at 0.88%, which the vaccine then reduced to 0.04%. So the net benefit, or the absolute risk reduction that you're being offered with a Pfizer vaccine, is 0.84%. That 95% number, that refers to the relative difference between 0.88 and 0.04%. That's what they call 95% relative risk reduction. And relative risk reduction is well known to be a misleading number, which is why the FDA recommends using absolute risk reduction instead. Which begs the question, how many people would have chosen to take the COVID-19 vaccines had they understood that they offered less than 1% benefit? So the first thing you need to understand about how Pfizer ran this study is that it didn't go according to their stated plan. There was an inoculated group and a placebo group of about 21,000 participants each, and they began the phase 3 trials in July of 2020. And the study was blind, which means the participants didn't know which group they were in. And this blinded trial was supposed to go on for 3 years until May 2nd of 2023. That would mark the end of phase 3 of the clinical trial. At that point, the trial would be unblinded, which means the placebo group would be offered the intervention if it were indicated and if they consented. But that's not what happened. Instead, after they had accumulated and released only 2 months' worth of trial data, Pfizer unblinded the study, which means they told all of the placebo and inoculation group participants which group they were in and offered the placebo group participants the option of moving over to the inoculated group. The Pfizer inoculations for COVID-19 and why they do more harm than good. We're the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, and our alliance of over 500 independent Canadian doctors, scientists, and healthcare practitioners is committed to providing quality, balanced, evidence-based information to the Canadian public about COVID-19 so that hospitalizations can be reduced, lives saved, and our country safely restored to normal as quickly as possible. We support the doctor-patient relationship and personalized care, informed consent and treatment options, free and open scientific discourse, and safe and effective vaccines. We'll begin with the most important premise in medicine. First, do no harm. The federal, provincial, and municipal governments in Canada have a responsibility to protect the health of Canadians as well as our charter rights and freedoms. Any medical interventions approved by Health Canada must
Thank you, everybody, for your patience during this little bit of delay. We had some technical things to work out. As you can see, we've got a fairly big array of equipment here and talented people working it. Apparently, the Wi-Fi was not quite as muscular as we might have hoped. That was one problem. But I think we've got the bugs worked out of it. And the reason we have all this, of course, is we want to reach a bigger audience than the people in this room. I've been walking around and chatting with some of you, and I get a real sense of excitement and anticipation from the folks I talk to that they want a process that is going to bring the truth out. And that's what the NCI, the National Citizens Inquiry, and the commissioners are here to deliver to the people of Canada, and that's the truth. So this is the first of 9 hearings that are going to be held across the country. The first one being here in Truro, National Citizens Inquiry. And they're each 3-day hearings. And I want to welcome the commissioners. I want to welcome the witnesses, on-site guests, all those following the proceedings from home. My name is Chess Crosby. I'm a longtime lawyer in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I focused on medical malpractice and class actions. I have a King's Counsel designation, and I was leader of the opposition in the House of Assembly in Newfoundland and Labrador. That's when I chose non-practicing status, so I'm not a practicing lawyer. This means I can't give legal advice or act as a barrister and solicitor in the courts. My position under the rules of this commission is administrator. The commission is consensual, it makes its own rules, and has no legal powers based in statute. It's based on the desire of Canadians for the truth. Now, I'd ask commissioners, in light of this truth-seeking mission, to just say a few words about who they are and why it is they've chosen to devote such substantial volunteer time to the mission of this commission of truth-seeking. Perhaps we could start on this side. Ken?
Hi, I'm Ken Drysdale. I'm a professional engineer with 41 years of experience. I spent a lot of that time preparing forensic engineering reports for various technical issues, and so that's kind of the background that I bring to this. On a more human side, I have 6 children, 4 grandchildren, 2 godchildren, and that's the reason I'm here.
Good morning. My name is Janice Kaikonen. I am here for all sorts of reasons, like you. I really believe that the truth must prevail in all of our discussions. I'm hoping for open discussion and debate to come back into this country, and that the freedom of expression, our constitutional rights and freedoms, are honored once again as the bedrock of our foundation. I have 7 children and 17 grandchildren. I often have to think about how many there are. I work with vulnerable populations, the people who are most at risk, in my day-to-day. I'm an academic, and I'm also a researcher. And most recently, I was elected as a school board trustee in Ontario. So I live on a farm. I raise turkeys as well. So I kind of have all the bases covered. And I'm here to hear you. I'm so thankful that there's so many of you who are willing to step up and to speak. I think it's very important, and we will do you justice, and we're going to listen. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Heather DiGregorio. I am a lawyer from Calgary, Alberta. I've been practicing at a regional firm in Alberta for close to 20 years. My area of law has been tax, so a little bit different from what we're talking about here. I've appeared at all levels of court, for tax, the Tax Court of Canada, the Federal Court of Appeal, most recently at the Supreme Court of Canada. But why I'm really here is my wish is that we have an honest and open inquiry here with a group of people who we've all committed to be open-minded and to hear from Canadians and really get to the bottom of what it is that we did as a country in our pandemic response and what effect did it have on us. And we want to determine, was there anything we did that worked? What can we do different next time? And we're here to listen, we're here to learn, and we're going to come up with recommendations on how to deal with the next one that comes along. And that's why I'm here.
Bonjour à tous. Mon nom est Bernard Massy. Je suis un consultant en biotechnologie. Je suis retiré. J'ai pris ma retraite comme scientifique du Conseil national de recherche où j'ai œuvré pendant 35 ans en biotechnologie avec une expertise dans les anticorps thérapeutiques et les vaccins à base adénovirus. I'm going to translate that immediately. So my name is Bernard Massy. I'm a retired independent consultant in biotechnology. Been working at the NRC for 35 years in the area of, to simplify, therapeutic antibody development and adenoviral-based vaccines. So I'm bringing to the table, I would say, scientific expertise, therapeutic antibody, and as the other member of the commission, on a human level, I was really, I would say, amiss with all of the story I was hearing from the scientific community and medical community, which to me didn't jive with my understanding of the science, and I wanted to go to the bottom of it. So that's why I thought I could join the inquiry and listen to people that can actually bring their perspective on what happened during this crisis of the pandemic. J'ai aussi 5 enfants, 2 petits-enfants, et je suis très préoccupé par l'avenir de ces enfants. I have 5 children and 2 grandchildren, and I'm really concerned with the world we're trying to build for them, and I'd like to see something different for the future, and I'm hoping that with this inquiry we're going to let truth emerge, and we're going to try to find ways to do better next time. Yes, sir.
Thank you kindly, Commissioners. There's a 5th Commissioner, Christiane Grieb, who has a very distinguished track record. She has a PhD in history. She knows a lot about war crimes and crimes against human rights. She's a practicing lawyer in Alberta, and she'll be able to say a bit more about herself when she appears at the next hearing. Our rules provide for commissioners, if in case of necessity, to not attend, but they have to either be present virtually so that they can be taking in the evidence as it comes out, or they can review it later. It gives us that bit of extra flexibility. Now, given the time thing that's gone on here, as much as I might like my own opening remarks, I'm going to suspend them for right now, and I think we'll go straight into the evidence. I might get a chance to make these remarks anticipating the evidence that the Commissioner should expect to hear sometime later in the proceedings. But right now, I guess we should really go to our first witness. Are we okay with that? Are we ready to go? Okay, let's go.
Good morning, everyone. This certainly isn't about me, but just by way of very brief introduction. My name is Chad Horton, and I'm a partner at McGilvery Injury and Insurance Law. And I'm here today and for the next couple of days to help facilitate this process and help these witnesses tell their stories. Dr. MILBURN.
Sitting in front of a lawyer is a place a doctor never wants to be.
Here we go. Before we get into the details of your examination, can you kindly provide the Commission with an overview of your education, training, and experience?
Sure. So my name is Chris MILBURN. I'm a native Nova Scotian. I graduated in 1999. I've been a full-time emerge doc, been involved with family medicine, but also importantly for the purposes of this, I've been quite involved with public health in several roles, both on several local committees, local initiatives over many years. I was a member and then head of the Canadian Medical Association Committee on Healthcare and Promotion, which was one of their core committees that dealt with public health issues. I was a longtime member and then the chairman for the Doctors Nova Scotia Public Health Issues Committee. So I have a foot in public health and a foot in frontline medicine.
Now, you may have somewhat answered this question already, but what are your primary areas of interest and involvement in medicine?
Yeah, so emergency medicine and public health are probably at the very opposite poles. Public health deals with populations and big picture recommendations, what's best for this population. Emergency medicine is the most focused part of medicine. It's one patient, one problem at one instant at a time. So I have a real interest in both of those, which are in a way polar opposites, but they really should connect.
Okay. And what was your specific role in early 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic?
So when the pandemic began, I was, from the public health point of view, I was still the chair of the Public Health Issues Committee for Doctors Nova Scotia, but I was also the chief of emergency medicine for Eastern Nova Scotia, for the Eastern Zone of Nova Scotia Health Authority. So I oversaw, I had a kind of a high-level oversight role on 13 different emergency room and urgent care centers from Antigonish right up to the tip of northern Cape Breton.
Can you explain your professional responsibilities as the emergency room chief of the Eastern Zone?
Yeah, so I was responsible for making sure that we had a coherent approach to providing emergency care for that zone. And so that, you can imagine that was kind of a broad role. And so when COVID hit, my role was to take all these new policies and procedures and to make sure that our staff at all the different sites was aware of what the approach was going to be, what was the safest and best approach to see a patient who might be infected with COVID. So I had, I was really kind of taking the policies and procedures that were being developed at a high level and trying to get our staff on the front lines up to speed.
Okay. So setting aside your duties as chief of emergency, but within your role as an emergency room physician, and I appreciate this number likely varies, but on average, how many patients could you expect to treat in the run of a regular week?
Yeah, so to some degree my schedule is flexible, but in a full week where I might do, say, 5 shifts, I could see up to 150 patients a week. So I was more or less functioning as a full-time emerge doc and doing the chief job as sort of in my spare time, we'll say.
That sounds busy.
I'm never bored.
So can you confirm for the record, Dr. MILBURN, that you've actually provided me with a copy of your CV?
Yes, I have given you my CV.
Okay, and we'll make that available to the Commission. So based on your education, training, experience, and any clinical literature that you had read or were familiar with, what was your understanding of the danger posed to public health by COVID-19?
I'll try to give you a brief answer. So when COVID first reared its spiky head in China, there was a lot of fear. I was one of the ones who was afraid because we have a very unstable and fractured emergency system already with a lot of worker shortages. So we were struggling to provide care. And when we kind of looked at, first China and then Italy and then New York City, we were quite afraid of what might come. At first we thought, we were given the idea that there's an extremely high mortality rate and that, quote unquote, everyone was at risk. That was actually a quote from our premier at one point. But we very quickly, in the first month or two, the data started to come out. The average age of death was, 80 or more than 80 in Italy. It became clear pretty quickly that it was what we call the risk age stratified. And it turns out that for a young, healthy person, the risk is maybe somewhere around 1/5,000th to 1/10,000th of the risk for an elderly, unwell person. So by the summer, certainly by the June or July of 2020, that age stratification of risk was becoming apparent.
Okay. Now, would you have been in a position in your role as an emergency doctor in chief to personally observe the impact of both the COVID-19 illness and also the impact of COVID policy measures on Nova Scotians in your area of responsibility being the Eastern Zone?
Yeah, for sure. So we had sick COVID patients, mostly, almost entirely elderly or what we call comorbid, and that was an issue. But I believe in my experience, it pales in comparison to the issues that I saw both as chief, secondhand, but also just personally working as a frontline doc. The impact that things like hospital shutdowns had. Like, for instance, I can rhyme off several patients who died of cancers that I believe they didn't need to die of because their care was delayed. I had patients who were scheduled for joint replacements who were living in chronic pain and suddenly saw the wait list stretch out over the horizon for them. I look after a nursing home for the last few years, and I saw those patients locked down. I saw patients in nursing homes give up, stop eating, and die because they were essentially prisoners and couldn't see family. I watched family outside windows crying, looking at patients inside. So I saw these terrible impacts of COVID policy, and they were much more prevalent. They were a much bigger issue than the impacts of actual COVID.
So, can you just repeat your conclusion again? What you just said at the end? You were saying.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk on the impacts of COVID. When we hear this in the mainstream news, or we hear politicians or bureaucrats talking about it, they talk about how COVID impacted us in the last few years. But although I did see some very, very elderly, very unwell people die after they got COVID, I didn't really see it shortening lifespans, but I saw major impacts on the population from COVID policy. So I'd like to distinguish those. There's impacts of COVID policy, which I think were huge. There's impacts of COVID, which I think were relatively small if you parse them out.
So you're talking about impacts of COVID policy, or you spoke about that partially. I want to explore that a little bit. Now, you described numerous observations you made over a period of time. During the relevant time that you were just discussing, did you look for answers regarding either the reasoning or the data supporting the policy decisions behind the scenarios that you've just described to us?
I did. So as chief of Emerge, nurses I worked with and a handful of physicians were concerned with policies. For instance, universal masking policy. Was that really necessary? Was it justified? It was extremely uncomfortable for nurses, and these policies were made by somebody who sat behind their own desk in Halifax and never had to wear a mask. So it was easy for them to make policy. When I asked for the justification, what I ended up getting back was either nothing in most cases, or when I did get back answers, the answer was, well, our committee met and we decided. So I was never provided with justification. Here are the papers, here are the minutes from the meetings. The committee that decided these things was in camera. It was not, we were not privy to what was happening. They'd never asked for our feedback on policies. They never asked for what we saw as the impact of those policies. How do you see this playing out? Is this good or bad? So we did, and I say we because as a group of doctors behind the scenes, we sent several emails to Dr. Strang to ask for things like, for instance, what's the justification behind recommending vaccinating children? The recommendations in Nova Scotia seem to actually go against the recommendations of NACI. And we sent formal letters, I sent informal emails, and the best I ever got back was because our committee decided.
So just one little point for the people watching at home or for members of the audience. When you say most of the meetings were in camera, what does that mean?
It means they were private. They involved politicians, the health minister, the premier. They involved some hand-picked bureaucrats, but physicians like me were not asked to be part of it. We were not privy to the notes. We were not privy to the data that was used. Those were private, confidential meetings.
And did you specifically ask for the notes or the minutes coming out of those meetings?
I specifically asked how those decisions were made. Could they please give me the justification? And again, I either got nothing or our committee decided, and that's why.
Do you have any more specific recollection of what sort of responses you got to those inquiries?
No, not much recollection because the usual reply was none. Emails would go off and they would disappear into a black hole and I would never hear back. They were mostly ignored. Oh, and that includes recently too. I've still been asking and they're still ignored and sucked into the black hole.
Oh, so no, excuse me, so no response whatsoever?
No response was the most common response.
And what was your perception about what was going on there?
Well, I think my perception was very much like most people who attempted to get answers, and the perception is that these decisions are. There's a saying: when you mix politics with science, you end up with politics. And these committees were made up. They did have people like Dr. Strang and some upper-level doctor bureaucrats on them, but the decisions I do not believe were, I don't believe they were scientifically based. I think they were politically based, and that's why we couldn't get an answer back, because it was a political decision made for a certain appearance rather than, following the science, so to speak.
So, myself as a Nova Scotian who occasionally listens to the radio, I do have some first-hand awareness of the fact that you had been in the media and had some involvement. But can you briefly describe your media involvement over the years?
Yeah, I've always been an outspoken guy. I'm willing to say my views in public and to try to back them up. And so I was asked for many years. I've appeared on. I've done interviews on CBC Radio, including I was asked to be part of this thing called the Issue Panel, which is a regular feature of CBC Information Morning in Cape Breton, where they get three people on, they throw out an issue that's topical in the news, the three people debate it and argue it. It's kind of off the cuff. I had been on this for a number of years. I can't tell you exactly how many times, but every few months I get asked to be on. And the typical way that would happen was they'd ask me, could I be on next Thursday? Yes. And then a few days before or just the day before, I'd get an email saying, here's going to be the topics. Because of my schedule, I would typically look at that, like the time that, this particular time that we're about to discuss, I looked at the email at midnight and I was to be on at 7:30, and I noticed that the topic was COVID policy. And I kind of thought, well, this is bound to be controversial, but I felt by that time I had tried to get answers from within the system, and I felt that the public needed to know that there were physicians, nurses, other people out there who had an inside view on the system but didn't agree with the policies, because there was, I believe, a real attempt to make it look like all of the doctors were on side. And I decided to go ahead and speak my views. I made it clear that I was not speaking for NSH. I was speaking as my own self, and but I felt people needed to know there was another side to this, and some doctors felt differently. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, when was your, and I understand from your evidence that you were on the issue panel by invitation a number of times over a period of time. When is the last time you appeared on the issue panel?
So yeah, so this would be in June of 2021. The move to vaccinate every human being in Canada was well in full. It was in full swing, and I was asked to be on. Like I say, I looked at the email the night before. The issues that came up that day were number one. The schools had just been put back in. They had been out for quite some time. They were just put back in. I was asked what I thought of them going back in, and what I said was, I don't think they should ever have been out. I think there was clear evidence that it was bad for kids to be out of school. Kids were not at risk from COVID, nor were they vectors, so I don't think they ever should have been out. So that I kind of contradicted public health's statements in that way. Number two, I was asked what I thought of potential vaccine passports, because they were just kind of on the horizon at that point. I said, number one, I think they're unconstitutional, and I also made the point that these vaccines were brand new, and by definition, we did not know long-term side effects. That's not an opinion, that was just truth. And the third thing I said that turned out to be controversial was that I thought public health's role should be advisory, not a rule-making body, because they were unaccountable, and that when we gave them this much power, that some people enjoyed that amount of power, and history shows us that people who are given power only give it up reluctantly. So I made those points, and that was the last time I was ever asked to be on the issue panel.
And more specifically, when was that? What was the date?
Yeah, so I can kind of tell you how things played out. So that was on a Thursday morning. I got numerous...
What month and year?
Early June 2021. I can't tell you exactly the date, but it was a Thursday morning. I got tons of supportive emails through the next couple of days. And then on Saturday, I got an email from friends saying, did you hear that Strang got ambushed at a press conference? And I looked it up and saw the clip, and Tim Bousquet of the Halifax Examiner had ambushed Dr. Strang with questions. He said, did you hear that MILBURN told people not to get vaccinated and basically said you were power hungry? So, you know, it was a mischaracterization of what I said. And so I've had what would you say, very reasonable communications with Dr. Strang in the past. So I sent him an email basically saying, look, I saw that you were ambushed. I didn't say it that way. I'd love to talk to you. Here's my cell number. So I reached out. I later that day saw his reply, which was, MILBURN should stick to emergency medicine, and I'll take care of public health, and basically accused me of not being qualified to speak because I wasn't an expert like him. So I didn't get a reply back from the email. So as I described it, I felt the icy winds blowing. And on the Tuesday morning, I got a call while I was at work from Dr. Don Bryan, the head of the Eastern Zone, who we had a long conversation. He explained to me that I had created vaccine hesitancy, that as head of Emerge, it wasn't appropriate for me to ever criticize public health, I had sort of undermined the NSHA, and I was told that I was no longer head of Emerge as of that point. I asked Dr. Bryan, the one thing I asked him, he and I have been colleagues for years, I said, I'm fine with all that if that's your decision. I obviously can't argue it, but please put this all in a memo, what you've told me. Please be public with it. I am going to be asked why I was fired. I would like you guys to state why I was fired, because you're the ones firing me. More than a week went by. I think he probably went to the lawyers of the NSHA, and what the statement that came out said, Dr. MILBURN is no longer head of Emerge. Thanks very much for your service. So they never publicly said all of the things that Dr. Bryan told me in a 25, 30-minute conversation, creating vaccine hesitancy, et cetera, all the reasons I was fired, they would not put in writing.
Do you have any awareness of any record of that conversation?
No. I had, like I say, a long time. I actually worked in the same office as Dr. Bryan, and part of my work, we had a great relationship for many years, so I trusted him. Looking back at it, I guess you should always record these things, trust no one. But I I really innocently thought that he would actually be honest and open and actually say what he's told me publicly, and I was very wrong.
So I just want to unpack a little bit of what you said there, and what I'm hearing is that one of their concerns was that you were promoting vaccine hesitancy. Was anything communicated to you with respect to what specific statement you made that could be construed as promoting vaccine hesitancy?
Yes, during the conversation. So one of the things that people should note and might be surprised, I'm vaccinated myself. I got the first 2 vaccines because we were told at that time, as a frontline staff, I work with the most critically ill and comorbid and elderly people there are in our community. I'm face to face with them on a regular basis. I was told that by being vaccinated, I would prevent or at least greatly lower my odds of passing it on. So I was vaccinated myself. So I'm a vaccinated anti-vaxxer. But in terms of promoting vaccine hesitancy, my great sin was in saying that this was a new vaccine and the side effects, especially the long-term side effects, were not well spelled out. So by definition, we couldn't develop a risk-benefit ratio because whenever I speak to a patient about getting any treatment, be it a vaccine or something else, I always talk about here's the benefits to you, here's the risks to you. The patient always makes the final decision, but I could say, based on this, I would recommend it or I wouldn't. I didn't have that information at that point. I couldn't advise somebody this vaccine is more benefit than risk to you. I only got it myself. I didn't know the risk-benefit ratio, but I was willing to take the chance because I thought it would prevent me from passing it on to my patients. I did it as a safety thing for my patients, but I wouldn't have recommended it to anyone else at that point with the dearth of evidence. But that was what I did. Was from Dr. Bryan's point of view, was I created vaccine hesitancy by daring to say that the vaccine might have side effects that we don't know about.
Now, I understand from the commencement of your testimony that you've been a practicing physician for more than 20 years. I understand from your testimony that you have significant emergency room experience, and you also advised that you had involvement in public health, or at least a strong interest in public health.
Great interest for over 20 years, yeah, and
so
involvement.
Within the scope of your education, training, and experience, do you have any knowledge, or is there any perspective that you're aware of within the medical realm that statement that we do not have long-term safety data was incorrect?
It turns out it was very correct. The first data on myocarditis was coming out at that time, but it wasn't public. It turns out we've had, I believe it's over 80 cases in Nova Scotia alone. That's the government data, not mine. And now, if you look at the Nova Scotia government website, they've admitted to a host of other side effects which were not apparent at that time, and certainly not told to patients at that time when they were choosing to be vaccinated or being coerced to be vaccinated. They were not told about these potential side effects. So I stand by my statement. It's just become more and more true over time.
So was it your understanding at that time, to put it directly, that you were stating an objective fact?
What I said, we don't know long-term side effects, was just a fact because that's just true with a new vaccine. It's not an opinion. It's not, that's MILBURN's take on it. That is just a fact, like the sky is blue.
So at any point during your career as an emergency physician or chief in Nova Scotia, did you ever sign any agreement or contract, or were you ever told that there were restrictions on the opinions you could express, either as a private citizen or within your capacity as a doctor?
No, absolutely not. I always labored under the impression that I had the same rights to free speech as anyone else in Canada. I was always extremely careful because not only was on the issue panel, but I got interviewed about other things on the radio or in the newspaper. And I always took great pains to say, this is my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for the health authority. I made that very clear. So I never signed anything to say that I would agree with all my colleagues or agree with Dr. Strang or not criticize my profession. Matter of fact, I think it's essential that we physicians do. I was very critical of my profession during our complicity in the opioid crisis, and thank God we were allowed to speak out, and we've somewhat turned that around. It's just essential for docs to be able to speak out, and absolutely, I never signed anything, was never told that I wasn't allowed to speak.
Okay. And from your earlier testimony, I understand that you had issued correspondence, or I think as you described it, you were seeking answers to the reasoning behind various policy decisions, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And when you did that, did you express any of your personal concerns, whether in your capacity as a private citizen or as a medical professional? Did you express any concerns about the policies that were being implemented in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had concerns, like I say, the masking policy is really decreases job satisfaction. It makes retention difficult. The school closure policies were very destructive for children. I expressed these both to some degree publicly, but behind the scenes I expressed these over and over, numerous concerns I had.
Okay. And was it your understanding that your termination was specifically related to the comments you made on the CBC program?
It absolutely was. Dr. Bryan made that very clear to me on the call. As a matter of fact, I had a very good performance review just several weeks before with Dr. Bryan, and then I appeared on the radio, and then I was told that because of what I said on the radio, I was being terminated.
Okay. So prior to your termination, after you had expressed concerns internally and asked questions about policies, did anyone professionally ever approach you and suggest that those views were unacceptable, that you had unacceptable views?
Sorry, after I spoke out?
No.
But before?
But prior to your termination?
No, I was never... Definitely, I understood that some doctors disagreed with me and some agreed with me, but I was never told that I wasn't allowed to have those views or not allowed to express them. No.
So, I guess was your first awareness that your expressions were problematic at that termination meeting?
Yes, but I will say that I'm far from innocent to these things. So I had watched I knew the lay of the land. I had watched other doctors be dragged through the mud and walk over the hot coals because of speaking out with their views. So I knew when I said those views, I knew they were potentially controversial and would potentially make some people angry at me. Did I expect to be fired as chief of ER? I did not. I didn't think it would go that far, even though I knew that it would ruffle some feathers.
Okay. Now, you indicated previously, and we didn't explore this, but you indicated that after your appearance on that particular CBC program in June of 2021, you had said that you had received supportive emails. Can you explain what you mean by that? Can you elaborate, please?
Yeah, from I was on the radio at 7:30 a.m. and by the time I first checked I got started to get texts, and then by the time I first checked my email a couple hours later, I had a couple of dozen emails in my inbox, and within a week, I had, I would say, at least a couple of hundred emails, people supporting me. After I got fired and that came out, I know for a fact that the NSHA and Dr. Bryan specifically received a lot of angry emails, sort of supporting me and supporting my right for free speech. So I know there was a lot of support on my side. There were detractors too. A Twitter mob came after me and organized to launch a formal complaint about me. That was all sort of public on Twitter. So there were both sides, but I did receive a lot of support.
A formal complaint on the basis of what?
That's all. You can read about that on Twitter. I for various reasons, I'm not allowed to talk about that, but you can see that play out on Twitter. Yeah.
So after you were terminated, do you, as chief of emergency, do you know if and when that position has been filled?
Yeah, my understanding, it was a very busy job. Theoretically, I was paid as a .2 position, but it was much more than that. So the job was, there's two people filling that role now, one for one part of the zone, one for the other.
Okay. So am I understanding correctly that your responsibilities were delegated to two of your colleagues?
Correct.
Not a new hire?
Not a new hire.
Okay. And I believe you testified earlier this morning that in your capacity as an emergency room physician, you would treat, or you could expect to treat approximately 150 patients per week. Was that correct?
That'd be a big week. That'd be sort of the maximum I'd see in a week. But yeah, average week would be definitely over 100. Yeah.
Okay. Average over 100. And where are you practicing now, and in what capacity?
I am an old-fashioned rural family doctor now. I work in the small village of Canso in a tiny hospital there, and I do everything from palliative care house calls to I mind the ER and whatever comes in, and I do family practice, and I take a mole off if you need it. So I'm an old-fashioned country doc now.
I expect that community appreciates you. So after leaving your previous role as an emergency room physician, wherein you would see between 100 and 150 patients per week, do you know if and when the vacancy that would have created has since been filled?
Well, Nova Scotia Health is constantly recruiting. Since I left that position, I've had colleagues retire. There's been new hires there. So the answer is, like, they don't specifically advertise my one position and try to fill that one position. It doesn't work that way. We have a sort of a stable of doctors. And when I stopped working at the regional site as an emerge doc, it just meant that 12, 14 shifts per month were unfilled, and the other docs had to step up and take more shifts on. So it made things busier for everyone else, and that does affect the overall picture, because these are doctors who might have picked up shifts that would have been empty in a rural emerge, let's say, but now they're doing more shifts in Sydney. So it does have an impact on the overall lay of the land in terms of staffing. Yeah.
Dr. MILBURN, broadly speaking, what motivated you to come in and speak with us today as part of this process?
Yeah, there's a whole other side to COVID out there that has not been well represented in the mainstream media, in discussions, in statements from our chief medical officers of health or our premiers. There's many Canadians who feel that these policies were overreach, probably unconstitutional in many ways, and that they were destructive and harmful. That side of the debate has not been well represented, and I just want to be a part of getting that message out there that there is another side. I don't think I'm always right. Maybe I'm wrong on some things, but we have to have the debate. The science is about debate and arguing, and Einstein said science can only flourish in an atmosphere of free speech. So that's why I'm here.
Final question. Based on what you just said, as you've gone through this process, do you have any awareness of, or have you had involvement? Let me ask this another way. As you've gone through this process, are you aware of any like-minded physicians practicing in Nova Scotia who share the concerns that you expressed today?
There are many. There's a saying, punish one, silence 1,000. And there are a lot of doctors behind the scenes, a lot of doctors and nurses who would love to speak out. I know there's some doctors who wanted to testify here, but were still uncomfortable to do so. Doctors and nurses were kind of held hostage because if we lose our position, it impacts. We can't care for our patients. And when it comes right down to it, doctors and nurses want to care for their patients. So this threat of job loss, or losing our licenses or whatnot is used. Basically, our love of our patients and our desire to care is actually used against us here, and it works well. I can tell you there are many, many doctors who'd like to speak out, many, many nurses who'd like to speak out, many other healthcare workers, and they still don't feel comfortable, even though we're in 2023.
Dr. MILBURN, thank you for coming in and answering these questions today.
Thanks for having me.
Don't leave.
My apology, Dr. MILBURN. I should have sworn you before you started your evidence, but we can fix that now.
Okay. I can assure you my wife swears at me enough.
Do you affirm that what you have told this commission of inquiry... Can you go to the mic, please?
Oh.
I can usually be heard around the room, but that's
Not around the world.
Dr. MILBURN, do you affirm that what you have told the Commission of Inquiry is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And one final point. We will, for the Commission's consideration, as Dr. MILBURN indicated, he's provided me with a copy of his CV. We will forward that to you for your consideration. And also 2 news articles, a CTV article, Cape Breton doctor removed as head of emergency medicine for the Eastern Zone, and another article by Saltwire, Dr. Chris MILBURN wants health authority to tell public reason for firing. We will put those in for the Commission's consideration, but they are a matter of public record. Thank you, Dr. MILBURN.
Dr. Mibble, I want to ask you 2 clarifying questions. The first one is about the first impression or reading that you had about the potential risk associated with the vaccine, and yet that you decided to take the vaccine considering that this could be the right thing to do, given that you were facing vulnerable people and didn't want to put them in danger. Mm-hmm. So my question is, you've been working in public health, so you probably have notion about epidemiology and all of these things that would actually support that kind of decision based on anything you had available. So my question is, what was your assessment at the time in terms of the potential for these vaccines to actually benefit in stopping or reducing transmission?
I know, so I'm not a vaccinologist, but I know enough about vaccines to know there's certain things like smallpox and measles which don't mutate. So the vaccines against them work very well. So we don't have smallpox now because we have a smallpox vaccine and we eliminated smallpox. There's other things like the flu. We've had flu shots for 25 years and we still have the flu. I knew that COVID fell more into the realm of the flu. But I think at the time when the vaccines first came out, we were still learning a lot about COVID. So I wasn't sure, is this going to be more like measles or more like the flu? The initial data, which I now I look at it a very different way. Let's say I don't trust it much, but the initial data seemed to say that it did decrease your odds of contracting COVID and therefore passing COVID on by a lot. So I had assessed my own risk by February of 2021 when I got vaccinated. I assessed my own risk as being low, so I didn't get vaccinated for me. I didn't think I needed it. I thought I would do fine with COVID, being skinny and relatively healthy. But I got it because I thought it would reduce the odds of passing it on. Obviously, the data was the data was in its infancy at that point, so I knew that wasn't a sure thing. But I went into it knowing that, and I was fine with taking that risk on myself. But I was not fine with pushing that risk on anyone else.
Okay, the other question is more on, I'm asking about your opinion. You mentioned that even today, in 2023, a lot of people in the medical field, practicing in hospital, and nurses and so on, are still reluctant to raise any issue they might have about past or even current policies. Based on your experience in this area, what would be your best guess of why is it that people are still locked, and what would it take to unlock their speak?
Yes, I'm going to go by memory, but I believe it was in 2021. Every physician in Nova Scotia got an email from the college saying your duty is to support all public health policies. So far, we have not had any problem with anti-maskers or anti-vaxxers. They actually use those words in the email to us, and we appreciate your compliance. And they talked about the need for unanimity. So the college is the body that gives us our license or can take it away. So it's not just physicians feeling like they might get in trouble. It's the college saying, you will agree with public health, you will be unanimous, you will not speak out against masks, you will not speak out against vaccines. So there's very good and logical reason. It's not just a feeling, but it's actually a dictum from colleges, and that's happened across Canada. It's not just in Nova Scotia. So there's still a lot of fear out there, and as I say, we're 3 years into this, and there's many doctors who may share my opinions or either completely or at least some of them, and would not be willing to go on the record with it. I would say the great majority are not willing to be on the record.
So if I understand what you're saying is that until such a time where the College of Physicians would actually remove that kind of directive, people will maintain their silence.
Correct, and I'm actually in the process of kind of speaking with the college behind the scenes to say I think they should walk back some of that now. For instance, the Cochrane collaboration has said that masks do not work, mask policies do not work. Are we now allowed to criticize them, given that the Cochrane collaboration has said they don't work? Are we allowed to state that? And so I'm pushing back, but I do think we need to. We need to keep working on this because physicians are still in fear of speaking their opinion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yep. My name is Nicole Snow, and I'm an injury and insurance lawyer with McGillivray Law. And I am honored and very happy to be a part of this process. Thank you for being here. We're just waiting for the witness who's virtual. Can you get him up here? Can you get him up here? Good morning, Dr. McCullough.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Not well, so we're going to work with that. It's So we'll keep going here, Dr. McCullough, so they can sort out the sound. I can hear you. It's not projecting that well. My name is Nicole.
I have until top of the hour. So.
Okay, yes, no problem at all, and I do apologize for being late. We're running a little bit late. We had some technical issues, so we're going to move through it, and I'll have you out here by the top of the hour. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Dr. McCullough, we know. Oh, okay, yeah. We're going to put you under oath.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Dr. McCullough, we know you're a cardiologist, an internist, an epidemiologist. Could you start by giving a summary of your qualifications and experience?
I'll do so quickly. I'm in practice in Dallas, Texas, in internal medicine and cardiology. I hold degrees from Baylor University, the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, the University of Michigan School of Public Health, and Southern Methodist University Graduate School. I've been in practice now for greater than 4 decades, and I have published extensively on the interface between heart and kidney disease in the last 3 years, have directed my clinical and research focus on COVID-19. I have over 60 peer-reviewed papers on SARS-CoV-2 infection, COVID-19 illness, and I've commented extensively in the U.S. Senate, multiple state senates, as well as in the media.
Thank you. And Dr. McCullough, you also have a clinical practice whereby you've had opportunity to treat COVID-19 or vaccine-injured patients?
Yes.
Okay, I want to turn to SARS-CoV-2, Dr. McCullough. The government of Canada determined in the early stages of the COVID crisis, so in and around early March 2020, that the virus was highly transmissible and virulent pathogen with an approximate 1% fatality rate for which there was no natural immunity and no effective antivirals. Can you comment on those conclusions?
I disagree with those. The SARS-CoV-2 infection was one that was early on well characterized. It was highly transmissible from symptomatic person to susceptible person. It had an overall case fatality rate far less than 1%, available to risk stratification, so the elderly, those with multiple risk factors at risk for death. And we knew early on that the virus was amenable to antivirals and, more importantly, use of drugs to reduce inflammation and thrombosis. So within a few months of the onset of the pandemic, myself and researchers had already synthesized and then quickly published the first peer-reviewed paper describing the treatment of SARS-CoV-2 infection at home to reduce the risk of hospitalization and death, and that was ultimately well supported over the next few months with multiple comparative studies.
Thank you. What do we know about the virulence of the virus now, Dr. McCullough?
It's greatly reduced with the continued progression of mutations to the Omicron and the subvariants.
Dr. McCullough, Canadians were advised that until a vaccine was created, that the only available interventions were non-pharmaceutical measures to reduce transmission in the population, such as frequency of contact reduction, such as isolation, as well as transmission probability reducing measures, such as social distancing, hand washing, mask wearing, and so forth. Can you comment on the assertion that these were the only available measures prior to the vaccine rollout?
Yeah, I disagree with that. Before the vaccine rollout, we had dozens of peer-reviewed manuscripts, comparative studies that sequenced multi-drug therapy for the acutely ill, worked to reduce the risk of hospitalization and death. And just shortly after 2021, we had breakthrough papers showing that virucidal nasal sprays and gargles markedly reduced PCR positivity and reduced the risk for hospitalization and death. There were no published studies at any time showing that public masking, social distancing, hand sanitizers, or locking down those people without the illness had any impact on the pandemic.
And Dr. McCullough, is there any real scientific logic to social distancing and masking and lockdowns in the context of this virus?
Not among well people. So there were no data suggesting that somebody perfectly well could transmit the disease and make somebody symptomatic who was adjacent to them. So the only thing that clinically was tractable is somebody acutely ill with the characteristic signs and symptoms to keep distance from others. So the only people who needed to go into quarantine were those acutely ill with SARS-CoV-2, not the universe of people without the illness.
Dr. McCullough, I know that you and a group of doctors did some early research on the COVID in the early stages, treatment of COVID in the early stages. You touched on that a bit earlier. Can you speak about your findings in a bit more detail and how those findings were received once published?
The very first paper published on sequence multi-drug therapy for COVID-19 in the American Journal of Medicine, August 7th, 2020, myself as the first author, was widely applauded. It's still the most frequently read paper from the American Journal of Medicine over the last 3 years. It's listed as a top paper of interest. It received multiple letters to the editor as interest with replies, and it became the base standard of the Association of American Physician and Surgeons Home Treatment Guide in October of 2020. So it was a breakthrough piece of information, a breakthrough paper, and it was followed up in December of 2020 in a updated protocol, which included now more drugs available to use in reviews in cardiovascular medicine in December of 2020.
Thank you. I want to turn your attention now to the COVID injection. It is sometimes, well, it's most often called a vaccine. It's sometimes called gene therapy. Are you able to speak to just what the injection is and how it operates?
In the United States, 92% of those who've received a COVID vaccine, I'll just use the word vaccine, have received messenger RNA vaccines. And the messenger RNA vaccines, in my interpretation, are synthetic genetic materials, a genetic code with the 3' and 5' synthetic nucleoside analog caps, which make the messenger RNA essentially indestructible. They are loaded on lipid nanoparticles to provide distribution throughout the body, including the brain, the heart, the adrenal glands, reproductive organs, all the critical organs in the body. Messenger RNA has been demonstrated to be circulatory in the bloodstream for at least 28 days. We know that it codes for the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. The spike protein was engineered by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and published by Menacherian colleagues in 2015. This work was done in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Biosecurity Annex Level 4. So this messenger RNA that people have received codes for the lethal part of the virus. And then once the messenger RNA is in the body, there is an uncontrolled production of the spike protein in terms of quantity and duration. The spike protein is proven in over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers to cause damage to the brain, the heart, the blood vessels, cause blood clotting, and cause immunologic problems in the bone marrow.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. So it sounds like then that the COVID injection doesn't operate like a true vaccine. Is that correct?
The messenger RNA vaccines harness the body's own genetic material to produce the spike protein. And the spike protein causes damage to the body, as I've described. Now, the aspiration, I anticipate, was that the spike protein would induce immunity. But we understood very quickly that there was no effective immunity from the vaccines. So within 90 days of release of the Pfizer vaccine in the Pfizer post-marketing data, which they kept as regulatory documents, and they were released under court order to the public, Pfizer had recorded dozens of fatalities due to COVID in people who were fully vaccinated with the product. And sadly, Pfizer recorded 1,223 deaths directly attributable to the vaccine.
Dr. McCullough, are you able to speak on the research and development process for this product? In other words, did it follow established regulatory standards for vaccines?
In a paper by Lalani and colleagues in the British Medical Journal in the last month, the description of messenger RNA development is laid out in a timeline since 1985. So the United States has had a long-standing interest in the development of messenger RNA. And then in 2012, DARPA, the research division of the U.S. military, they created a program called the ADEPT P3 program. And it's on their website even today, stating that the military had a desire to use messenger RNA to end pandemics within 60 days. So the United States made an unprecedented government investment of messenger RNA. However, human studies were never performed until we had a condensed, rushed production of the vaccines for COVID-19 in Operation Warp Speed. So it had a very long development cycle. There were many issues to tackle, and then it was in a condensed set of prospective randomized trials in order to gain emergency use authorized approval.
Did safety and efficacy have to be proven in the production of the product?
Safety and efficacy always have to be proven. So with genetic products, the safety by regulatory standards takes a 5-year timeline. So the safety study should have been started way in advance, since the United States has been working on this since 1985, and they simply weren't done. Efficacy had to be proved for the outcome of hospitalization and death. And hospitalization and death was never a primary or secondary endpoint of any trial. And so there can be no claims that the vaccines reduced hospitalization and deaths, since they weren't assessed in these trials. Where recorded, there was no reduction in hospitalization and death. In fact, deaths were more frequent in those who took a vaccine. And in the United States, the consent form doesn't make the claim that the vaccines reduce hospitalization and death.
I want to turn your attention to the vaccine event recording systems, Dr. McCullough. I know in the U.S. where you are, there's the VAERS system. In Canada, we have CAFIS. It's the Canadian Adverse Events Following Immunization Surveillance System. There's the Yellow Card system in the UK and the European Safety Monitoring System. These systems have been in place for decades, as I understand it, at least in Canada. CAFIS has been in place since 1987. Can you speak about what, if any, unusual findings are showing up in these vaccine reporting systems following the rollout of the COVID injection?
On June 11, 2022, the World Council for Health summarized those safety data systems, 39 total, but 4 major ones, including VAERS, Yellow Card, the EU UDRA system, and the WHO VigiSafe system. All of them have been recording record numbers of injuries, disabilities, and deaths. For example, in the U.S. VAERS system, all vaccines combined and accumulating all injections before COVID, a child would receive greater than 70 injections over the course of childhood per American child, and we knew 98% of Americans were taking vaccines at this level. There was a total, on average, of 158 deaths per year in this entire data system, which is vast. With COVID-19 vaccines, as we sit here today, as of March 3rd, 2023, for U.S. domestic cases only, VAERS has recorded 17,071 deaths that have occurred within a few days of taking the COVID-19 vaccines, and 16,454 permanently disabled Americans. The VAERS reports are largely done by doctors, nurses, and those caring for patients where they believe the vaccine is the cause of the injury or death.
Dr. McCullough, is there an accepted percentage of adverse events that are considered medically tolerable, if you will, beyond which the product will be removed from the market for safety concerns?
I've chaired over 24 data safety monitoring boards as the head of the board or a member, including those for the NIH, BARDA, the military research division of the NIH, as well as pharmaceutical companies, in vitro diagnostic companies. And it's my testimony that 5, 10, 15, no more than 50 deaths, even for the largest program, would ever be tolerable. That programs would be shut down, and then a deep dive on safety to figure out why people are dying after taking an injection. So it's my testimony that, knowing what we know with the rollout of Pfizer in the United States was started December 10th, 2020. Pfizer should have been pulled off the market before the end of January of 2021, with fewer than 27 million Americans being injected. Moderna probably should never have rolled out, and if it rolled out, it would have been pulled off the market shortly afterwards. Janssen, again, should have never had market entry because Pfizer and the entire product line would be off the market because there would be a understanding that the spike protein being produced is lethal to the human body.
Dr. McCullough, you spoke a little bit on adverse events already, but would you speak in a little more detail on the cardiovascular events that are medically known to be connected to these COVID vaccines?
There's over 200 peer-reviewed papers published on cardiovascular syndromes directly attributed to COVID-19 vaccination and agreed to by regulatory authorities. One of them is myocarditis or heart inflammation. 2 studies have indicated that 2.5% of people who take a vaccine suffer heart damage. About half of them it's symptomatic, half of them it's not. The peak age is 18 to 24 years. 90% are men, 10% women. It's a skewed distribution with the tail up into the 60s and 70s. There have been fatal cases, autopsy proven by Verma, Choi, Patone, and Gill. And it is conclusive that in a fraction of those who received the COVID-19 vaccine that heart inflammation or myocarditis is fatal, and the mechanism of death is sudden cardiac death, a sudden arrhythmic death, a young person collapsing and not being resuscitated by CPR. This is now well described here in the peer-reviewed literature. An important paper by Yonker and colleagues in Circulation from Harvard has shown in young boys and girls hospitalized at Massachusetts General Hospital with myocarditis, and about 90% acutely are hospitalized to have recognized the symptoms, that those who are having myocarditis have unopposed spike protein circulating in the body, damaging the heart. Those not affected with myocarditis actually have appropriate antibodies neutralizing the spike protein. So what I conclude is that, unfortunately, a small number of people do produce spike protein that is not effectively neutralized by the antibodies, and so they have unabated heart damage. So myocarditis is lethal, and of course, a single death in a young person is unacceptable because young people are not at risk for hospitalization and death with the virus. So the COVID-19 vaccines should have always been contraindicated for young people not at risk for the illness. In addition to that, the vaccines cause a progression of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. They precipitate coronary atherosclerotic plaque rupture and traditional myocardial infarction. The vaccines are proven to cause blood clots, both in arteries and in veins. And the U.S. FDA is published on this in a paper by Wu and colleagues, have demonstrated thousands of Americans developing blood clots after COVID-19 vaccines, where the FDA agrees the vaccines cause the blood clots, describing them going from the ankle to the hip, so very large blood clots in the venous system. In the Wu paper, 11% are fatal. Additionally, the COVID-19 vaccines have been associated with a whole variety of other cardiovascular manifestations, including vasculitis, a problem of inflammation in the blood vessels, in the kidneys. In a paper in the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology, Canny and colleagues describe the progression of the vasculitic and nephritic kidney disease in those worsening their chances of survival free of dialysis. And in summary, the COVID-19 vaccines, by the mechanism of myocarditis, progression of cardiovascular disease, and blood clots, are believed to be the cause of unknown death in any individual where the vaccine is known to be taken by that person.
Thank you. Dr. McCullough, the Canadian government has maintained that the COVID vaccines are both safe and effective and continues to encourage Canadians to take them, including children, to vaccinate and to booster. So given what you have had to say about COVID-19, its virulence, the vaccine, and the statistics on adverse events, what is your opinion on whether the vaccine is both safe and effective?
But the decision on safe and effective is made by senior doctors with medical authority. So I would have, and I do have medical authority over government officials in Canada. So it's my testimony today that the vaccines are neither safe nor effective, and that opinion has superiority and supersedes any government statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McCullough. My last question is really just about corrective measures. A lot of people the world over have taken the injections. What, if anything, can they do to help mitigate any damage that may have occurred in their bodies?
2 points. One is the toxicity and the risk of death appears to be cumulative. So the first point is take no more injections because the next one could be fatal or disabling. Second point is to be vigilant. That blood clots, heart damage, neurologic damage, intracranial hemorrhage, stroke, all of these need to be clinically recognized and treated the best they can conventionally. None of the governments have started large research programs into vaccine injuries, disabilities, and death, and that research is greatly needed. Very similar to the tobacco settlement and the final recognition that tobacco causes disease. In the U.S. tobacco settlement, much of the money received by the tobacco industry had to be turned around into research for doctors to learn how to treat patients. We'll need a similar type of program with COVID-19 vaccine injuries. A paper by Zogby and colleagues, a valid representative survey in the United States, showed that 15% of those who've taken a vaccine have some new medical illness, some new disease that we're dealing with. I've covered just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the cardiovascular complications, but they also span the fields of neuropsychiatric problems, autoimmune problems, and so there's a great medical need to care for those individuals. And I would just say there's also an acute medical need, even though very few people now are taking COVID-19 vaccines. This CDC V-Safe data, which was released under court order, reveals 7 to 8% of people who take a vaccine have to acutely go to the hospital and be hospitalized, the emergency room or urgent care center. So there's a great need to still manage the acute problems that develop within a few hours of taking a shot.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. I thank you sincerely for giving evidence here at this inquiry today. Don't go away just yet. I'm leaving a few minutes here in case any of the commissioners would have questions for you. Thank you very much. That's all right.
Hi, Dr. McCullough. Thank you very much. My name is Bernard Massy. I have some expertise in biotechnology and vaccine. So I've been following everything you've published and said on many conferences. One of the things that really puzzles me is what's happening with all of the evidence that has been pouring for more than 2 years. What's happening that the medical establishment and all of the health institutions are still promoting that kind of intervention. What
in the United States, in the United States, the medical establishment, I think, has been greatly influenced by the COVID Community Core Program. The COVID Community Core Program, announced early in 2021, was over $13 billion that was sent out by the White House and the Department of Health and Human Services to a variety of health institutions, thousands of media outlets, Hollywood, pro sports teams, all to promote the vaccines. We know separately that Pfizer and Moderna contracted a public relations firm called Weber Shandwick, and Weber Shandwick initiated a corporate program called Plan VX Plan VX promoted vaccine mandates within large companies. And then lastly, Weber Shandwick had an installed marketing unit within the CDC vaccine office. This has all been uncovered by Senator Rand Paul in October of 2022 and is publicly disclosed.
Thank you.
Okay, those are all the questions. Thank you so much, Dr. McCullough, for appearing here today. You can talk to
It's quite an extra.
Commissioners, this is
The Pfizer inoculations for COVID-19 and why they do more harm than good. We're the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, and our alliance of over 500 independent Canadian doctors, scientists, and healthcare practitioners is committed to providing quality, balanced, evidence-based information to the Canadian public about COVID-19 so that hospitalizations can be reduced, lives saved, and our country safely restored to normal as quickly as possible. We support the doctor-patient relationship and personalized care, informed consent and treatment options, free and open scientific discourse, and safe and effective vaccines. We'll begin with the most important premise in medicine. First, do no harm. The federal, provincial, and municipal governments in Canada have a responsibility to protect the health of Canadians as well as our charter rights and freedoms. Any medical interventions approved by Health Canada must first be proven safe. Due diligence and research, as well as adherence to the established protocols of the doctor-patient relationship, informed consent, and scientific inquiry are essential to carrying out that responsibility. Deviating from those practices, causing harm, and failing to disclose risks of harm is negligent at best. It's important to understand
Testing? Testing, yeah. No. Center. Maybe it's... How close does it have to be? But, okay. Does that work? Does that work? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's perfect. I don't think so. So I'm sorry, excuse me, sorry. Oh yeah, it does, it carry like...
Yeah, you have to be fairly close. Like that. Is good. Okay. Don't step too far back.
Okay.
Because it's picking up on live stream, but our in-house film, it's hard to do both at the same time. So we're prioritizing live stream. So you just want to stay a little bit closer because I can only go so far.
Okay.
Okay, does that make sense?
Perfect. I'm not
Proceeding. We're going to commence proceedings. If you'd be kind enough to take your seats, please. Be seated, please.
Okay. So I'm going to let you come in here to do this morning.
Okay, this, do you want to announce your calling?
Like on? Yeah. Okay, everybody, thanks for taking your seats. We have our next witness up, who is Dr. Patrick Phillips out of Ontario. So I'll let you bring him up on the screen there. Okay. Hi, Dr. Phillips. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So before we get started here, we're going to affirm you. So I'm going to let that happen right now.
Dr. Phillips, do you affirm that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Phillips. You're joining us from Ontario.
I am. Northern Ontario, yes.
Thank you for being here to give testimony in this proceeding. Dr. Phillips, can you start by going over your medical credentials?
Yes, so I graduated from Dalhousie Medical School in New Brunswick in 2016. After that, I did go to the University of Toronto, where I completed my 2-year family medicine residency. And after that, I entered into practice.
All right, and can you give a little summary of where you were practicing?
Sure. Yeah, like many new graduates, I primarily worked locums, which is basically filling in temporarily at various locations, as well as I had a weekly addictions medicine practice where I saw patients once a week in downtown Toronto, giving methadone and Suboxone. But as time went on over the last few years, I did kind of narrow down the places where I was working, doing emerge and family medicine, to Nippigan and Englehart, and then eventually I moved full-time to Englehart at the beginning of 2021.
Okay, and your locums were in the area of family medicine and emergency medicine, or yeah?
Yes.
Okay. And your practice in Nippigan was in the area of emergency department work or family?
Both, yeah. So comprehensive family, which is inpatients, office-based family medicine, and emergency.
Thank you. And Dr. Phillips, can you confirm that you sent me a copy of your CV?
I did.
All right, and the CV, for the record, is exhibit number TR001. Are you currently practicing, Dr. Phillips?
No, I'm not. I'm currently, my medical license is suspended by the CPSO since May 3rd, 2022.
Okay, and why was your medical license suspended?
So it was suspended primarily for holding a medical opinion that is contrary to the public health directives, and some of the consequences of that. We'll get into some of those details later, but that's essentially it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a little bit. When was the suspension effective?
May 3rd, 2022.
Dr. Phillips, did you take the Hippocratic Oath, and what is that?
I did take the Hippocratic Oath as part of our ceremony at Dalhousie Medicine. It's an oath basically that the medical profession has taken, or some other oaths that are also taken across the world in order to uphold medical ethics and to put the patient and our oath to the patient first above any other authority. so that the patient's interests are always the number one priority of doctors in that doctor-patient relationship.
And I'm sure you took that oath seriously. Do you know what the Declaration of Geneva is, Dr. Phillips?
Yeah, so during the course of World War II, both in Germany and Japan and many other places, there were atrocities committed by these regimes that were primarily carried out by doctors, physicians who were actually captured by a public health ethos, right, of believing they're doing what's best for the race. For the Aryan race, as an example, in Germany, or just following government directives or following orders. And so after the doctor trials in Nuremberg in 1947, Canada, among many other nations, signed on to the World Medical Association. And the World Medical Association came up with this oath as a way to prevent those atrocities from happening again, so that doctors will not just follow orders blindly, but will put the rights of their patient first. And if I can quote, I won't do the whole thing, but just a few of these, which I think are very relevant. Half the medical schools in the U.S. Make the oath of the Declaration of Geneva, and most of them in Europe. I'll just pull a couple out of it here. I solemnly pledge to dedicate my life to the service of humanity. I will respect the autonomy and dignity of my patient. I will maintain the utmost respect for human life. And most pertinent, I think, here is I will not use my medical knowledge to violate human rights and civil liberties, even under threat. Okay. So that was Canada's a signatory to this.
Thank you. And it sounds like those passages in particular resonated with you, Dr. Phillips, did they?
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Phillips, on April 30, 2021, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, Ontario, issued a statement forbidding physicians from questioning or debating the official COVID-19 response measures in Ontario. What do you know about this, and can you explain, give a little more detail on that?
Yeah, so although the college was quietly coming after doctors for having an opinion that goes contrary to the government narrative before this, amazingly, the college came out and very explicitly forbid doctors from carrying out our oath and scientific method for patients. So what they state in their message that they just sent out as a tweet, it wasn't a policy, it wasn't a regulation, but they put this out saying that physicians hold a unique position of trust within the public and have a professional responsibility to not communicate anti-vaccine, anti-masking, anti-distancing, and anti-lockdown statements and or promoting unsupported, unproven treatments for COVID-19. They go on to say physicians who put the public at risk may face an investigation by the CPSO and disciplinary action when warranted. Okay. So this was shocking to me and many others. So as a result, I gathered together with a group of physicians, and we together created Canadian Physicians for Science and Truth and made a declaration asking and demanding for the CPSO to rescind their statement. And in that declaration, which has thousands of signatories of the public, and there's over 700 signatories in the physician category. Well, not all those are embedded, but there's definitely hundreds in there. Basically saying that this statement, to follow this, would be a violation of our three things. So one is the scientific method, which requires the advancement of medicine, requires that we have to challenge the status quo. We have to be able to speak freely and to debate things, and that requires us to be able to be wrong, right? Because otherwise, you can never challenge things. The other one is our obligation to give evidence-based medicine to our patients, and that means discussing the evidence. If the evidence says there's people are dying from this vaccine, that people are suffering severe adverse events or that it's not effective, those could be construed as anti-vaccine views, but they're true. And so we have an obligation as physicians, no matter what the college says, to give the truth to our patients as we see it. The third one is our duty of informed consent. So in order for us to administer a vaccine to somebody, they have the right to be informed of all of these things, about the fact that we don't have any long-term data, but the fact that patients have died from these vaccines, and many others, including for lockdowns, for masking, and others. So without that, if doctors are muzzled, patients don't get informed consent, and that is their right. And so we basically demanded from the CPSO to rescind their statement, which they did not do.
Okay. And you mentioned this group of physicians that got together and created this declaration. Do you happen to know the website?
Yes, CanadianPhysicians.org, where you can see our declaration in its entirety and the signatories too.
Thank you. Dr. Phillips, where were you practicing in and around the time of the pandemic, when the pandemic was declared? In the beginning of 2020, I was working between two sites. So I was living downtown Toronto, but working primarily in Northern Ontario, flying in, flying out to Nipigon and Engelhart. Okay. And your practice was in hospital setting?
Hospital and office-based as well, in Nipigon.
What measures were taken in your region with respect to the COVID crisis? So in the hospitals you're working in and et cetera.
Yeah, there were a number, they were changing all of the time, but some of the most striking ones were the switch from in-person medical care to phone-based care in the medical community. And that was throughout all of Ontario, where patients could not see their doctor unless in very rare circumstances. So almost all medicine was done just by phone, where doctors were asking patients to do their own physical examination, which they're not trained to do, and basically doing guesswork, which was quite concerning.
Did that pose any other Did that pose any other concerns for you?
Definitely. I mean, in the beginning, I was watching a lot of what the media was showing in Wuhan and Italy and New York, and so I was concerned that there was an extremely deadly virus coming around at that time. I don't believe that now, but at that time I thought maybe this is worth it. Maybe this is something we need to do, because if everybody comes into the office and catches COVID, the deadly form of COVID that I thought was coming, then I thought it could be worth it. But yeah, that was kind of my main concern until later on when I started to see the real consequences of this shift. And that's when I began to speak out.
Okay, and what kind of consequences were you seeing in your practice?
Yeah, so I was seeing a few things. So one is some devastation to both the physical health and the mental health of patients. To give you one example, there was one patient who I saw in Emerge. Over the last year, she was treated for back pain over the phone, to the severe back pain to the point that she was on opioids. And she only came to see me in Emerge by the time her pain was so bad she had to call an ambulance. And when I saw her and physically examined her, what she called back pain was actually a giant tumor. It was actually her liver was riddled with cancer. And that was not the only example of this late presenting cancer of patients who were treated over the phone. If they were able to see their doctor in person, that could have been caught much earlier and possibly treated. But by the time I saw her, it was metastatic. And I saw a number of patients like that. The other thing I saw that really concerned me was the mental health of patients. And while I did see an uptick in overdoses and suicidality and depression in Emerge in adults, what was most striking was the children. I'd never seen so many suicidal children, as young as 8. It's very rare for that to happen. But what I noticed a common thread, and that was children during the height of lockdowns when schools were closed, parents were told by public health to keep their kids at home. No play dates, no play, no sports, nothing. And so these children were essentially locked up at home with no friends, no socialization. And that, I believe, was the leading cause of the suicidality in children, which concerned me. And nobody was saying anything. In fact, what I found most concerning is at that exact same time, the Ontario Medical Association, the Ontario Hospital Association, Public Health were putting out advertisements saying, Ontario's doctors are calling for stricter lockdowns to stop the spread of COVID. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm definitely not. And they didn't even send out a survey to ask what my opinion was. And so that was what really led to me believing I needed to speak out here, because there's no other side of the story that's getting heard, with the exception of very few physicians.
Okay. And Dr. Phillips, you worked in a hospital setting, and there was a lot of early concern that hospitals were going to be overrun by patients with COVID-19. What did you observe with that respect?
Yeah, so I did not see that at all. Quite the contrary. I saw, especially in the beginning, steep decline in the amount of patients who came in, especially in the early 2020. I thought it was kind of nice at the time, not knowing these harmful consequences, because I was paid the same amount to do very little. But our emergency rooms were empty, and there was very little COVID in our communities. Nevertheless, because of the media, the people in our communities were still afraid and still reluctant to come in to seek care in the emergency department, which is devastating for some people.
Right. Have you had occasion to treat any patients that you believed were suffering from COVID-19?
Very few, but yes, I did. We had a few in our community. The COVID wave came later, mostly after I was no longer working at the hospital, but while we did have a few, I did treat one while I was working in the hospital in Kirkland Lake.
And can you offer any details about that situation?
Yeah, in my opinion, it was a very disturbing story. I was a middle, like 50s, 60s woman who came in diagnosed with COVID, and she was short of breath to the point she needed oxygen. And at that time, there was so much evidence. There were study upon study. I think there were 30 to 40. And when you bring those together, showing that ivermectin would reduce mortality by 50 to 70%. We have very few drugs that can do that. And so when she came in and she was under my care, at that point I was working as a hospitalist on the floor in Kirkland Lake, which is his sister hospital to mine in Englehart. I felt a duty to give her informed consent and to prescribe to her ivermectin for the treatment of her COVID, because she had a number of risk factors for severe disease or death. And so when I wrote that, the pharmacist reported me to the chief of staff. The chief of staff then ordered me to cancel that order for ivermectin, including the zinc and vitamin D and other harmless vitamins that I also prescribed to her that we know can be helpful. And he ordered me to call the local ICU in Sudbury, well, the distant ICU in Sudbury, and get their permission to prescribe outside the guidelines, which require remdesivir, which is very harmful, and others, such as steroids. And they basically only allowed me to prescribe the steroids. So I gave her steroids, and but I was shocked that this chief of staff ordered me to cancel life-saving treatment to this patient that in peer-reviewed research shows reduces mortality.
Approximately when was that?
This was in March of 2021.
Okay. And I think you said that was March 2021 that occurred?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you had occasion to prescribe ivermectin again, or was that the end of your prescriptions for ivermectin?
I mean, I would have, but again, in my community, there was very little COVID, and the ones that were there, they were very mild, to the point they didn't need to be hospitalized for the most part. I did prescribe ivermectin again to a patient who had what I believe could have been a vaccine injury, where she received a dose of the vaccine, and after that was had nausea lasting for weeks, nausea, fatigue, muscle aches, and so I did prescribe according to the FLCCC protocol, which was ivermectin, fluvoxamine, and atorvastatin, which was successful, did resolve her symptoms, but the pharmacist reported me to the college, and as a result of that, the college did put a restriction on my license, forbidding me from prescribing ivermectin, fluvoxamine, or atorvastatin for COVID, and among other things, such as vaccine exemptions and mask exemptions.
Okay, and we'll get into some of those details on the charges in a moment. I want to move into the post-vaccine period. So you've spoken about that a little bit. You had a patient that had a vaccine injury. The rollout of the vaccines was in and around early 2021. What, if any, protocols were put in place at the hospital you were working in with respect to monitoring vaccine effects?
So, I mean, our hospital spoke nothing at all about monitoring vaccine effects, but we do have a legal obligation to report adverse events. Some of the more serious ones we're obligated to, and then other ones we're kind of permitted to.
Is it a form that you complete, Dr. Phillips?
Yeah, there's a form. So the CAFIS system basically is very local in the sense that there's a form through Ontario Public Health that we fill out and send to our local public health officer, who then is supposed to investigate and then pass the investigation on to Public Health Ontario, and then they're supposed to amalgamate the data and pass it on to Health Canada.
Okay, and you mentioned CAFIS, that's a Canadian Adverse Event Following Immunization Surveillance System? It's a bit of a mouthful. So the adverse event forms that you were just speaking about, those were the forms that the doctors would fill out in the hospital if they thought something was a vaccine adverse event. Okay.
Yes.
And can you confirm that you gave me one of those blank forms?
Yes.
Okay. And that is marked as Exhibit TR 0001A. So TR 0001A is the exhibit. It's the Adverse Event Following Immunization Reporting Form. And so, Dr. Phillips, as I understand the evidence that you just gave, you would not be forwarding that form to the CAFIS system. You would be forwarding it to a public health officer who would then determine whether it would be filed with CAFIS.
Correct.
Okay. Is vaccine aftermarket monitoring an expectation for physicians?
It is supposed to be, yes.
And for what reason?
We're actually obligated by law for certain, like severe ones, we're obligated to report these adverse events when we see them. And then outside of that, there's kind of more of a permissive requirement. I think, in my opinion, it's an ethical requirement to pass on all adverse events that happen after these, especially in the context of an emergency use authorization. So something that's not fully tested, but yet was rolled out early. Even more, we have an obligation, in my opinion, an ethical obligation to report all possible adverse events, so that the CAFIS system will be able to detect possible harm and be able to withdraw the product if it's warranted.
Okay, and so the purpose is to monitor the safety of the product and the effectiveness of the product. Is that correct? Okay.
Exactly.
What kind of events were physicians required to take note of according to the form, the adverse event form?
Yeah, so it's pretty broad on the form. I can't recall all of them off the top of my head, but so.
Well, how about this?
So
if you don't have
it, I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, it's okay if you don't have it in front of you. It's marked as an exhibit in any event. Did you have any occasion to complete any of those adverse event forms?
Yes.
All right,
yes,
can you
I did.
elaborate on that?
Yeah, I did. So I can kind of go over. I did complete 10 adverse event reports that I sent in. I'll give you kind of the basic details of these reports really quickly here. All but one of them, as far as I know, were not submitted, and so 9 of them were rejected, as far as I know. So the first one is a person with nausea for 2 weeks and vomiting, including hematemesis or bloody vomiting. This started 4 days after the second dose of Moderna. The second one was a new onset severe vertigo and ringing in the ears, diagnosed as vestibular neuritis, that came up 4 weeks after his Moderna shot. The third one was sudden onset in a young woman, sudden onset arm weakness for 4 hours, weakness in the arm and complete loss of or decrease of sensation entire half of her body, with persistent loss of sensation in fingers, lasting hours to days. So in my opinion, it was stroke until determined otherwise, so I started her on the stroke protocol.
How many days post-vaccination was she?
This was 9 days after her Moderna shot. The fourth one was an elderly woman with severe delirium, high fever, and left arm numbness 4 hours after her Moderna shot, lasting greater than 48 hours. That's the point I saw her. The fifth one was a woman with dementia, but was functional at home, able to talk and walk, but after her dose, I'm not sure which vaccine it was, she lost the ability. She slowly declined over the course of about 2 to 3 weeks, and lost the ability to communicate and to walk as well. The sixth one was an older woman who developed palpitations, so a heart issue, possible arrhythmia with severe hypertension, and that started 1 week after her Moderna shot. The seventh one was a younger woman with persistent numbness to the right side of her forehead, so she lost sensation there entirely. No other symptoms really, but that started 2 hours after her Pfizer shot and then persisted. The eighth one was intermittent left, so a man with intermittent left arm weakness. His arm would become weak. He was dropping things, was no longer able to work. That would happen 3 to 5 times a day. That started 2 days after his Pfizer shot, and 2 weeks later. So it was 2 days after, and then persisted, and then 2 weeks later developed persistent daily headache, nausea, and vomiting. So it could have been something going on in his brain or others. I don't have the final diagnosis because as in emergency we don't follow our patients, but we pass them on to others. They're investigated. The ninth one was a middle-aged woman who tragically, 16 days after her Pfizer shot, with no other health history, had a devastating bleed into her brain after her blood pressure surged into the 200s. She lost the ability to talk and walk. She was found on the floor, which again was devastating. And the 10th one is the only one that I know was actually accepted as an adverse event, and that was a severe rash on a woman's arm that came on 8 days after the vaccine. That was kind of a ring-like rash that spread up above her shoulder and down below.
Okay. And so, as you've indicated, that 10th one where there was the rash on the arm, that was at the site of the vaccination, was it? Yeah. That's the only one that you know definitively was accepted. And what happened with the rest of them? Did anyone contact you?
Yeah, so I did. I was contacted by the public health officer. He sent me a letter after the first 5, who told me that none of these 5 meet their criteria for an adverse event, so they've all been rejected, and take note of that when I'm doing my reports. I sent a note back to him by fax saying asking for the details of why each one of these were reported. Do you need more information? I want to make sure they're not just rejected for a clerical reason, and I did not get a reply. So I was very concerned about this. I was concerned that the public were not getting informed consent about these possible severe adverse events. Many of those may have been strokes. And so in order for us to have a safe vaccine safety system, they need to be able to get these reports to be able to know if a product needs to be pulled off. So I did go public. I did an interview with Rebel News where I spoke about these adverse events and the letter that I got sent saying they're all getting rejected. And as a result, that public health officer complained to the CPSO, and they're investigating me and have charged me with professional misconduct for those 9 of the adverse events that were not accepted. They're calling it being incompetent in filing adverse event reports, and they're saying I failed to meet the standard of practice of the profession.
Okay, stunning. All right, Dr. Phillips, let's talk a little bit about your personal life outside of your clinical practice. You've indicated that you were quite vocal about the concerns that you had that were going on inside your practice and in the hospital system. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Like my Twitter feed?
You indicated that you were quite vocal outside of the hospital system. So if you could get into a little bit of and you also indicated the public health officer came after you when you were vocal. So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah. So around that time, like I said, at the end of 2020, when I was seeing that those harms from the lockdowns and the medical association asking us to saying doctors are calling for harsher lockdowns, that was the moment that I made the decision that I need to speak out. And so I got onto my Twitter account, and that's where I've done a lot of my speaking out about public health measures, about the science that public health isn't talking about, like vitamin D, exercise, things like that, other public health measures that are effective, and the ineffectiveness and harms of lockdowns, of masking, and of these vaccines. So I spoke out on Twitter, and I've done a number of alternative media interviews, and I even did a press conference with Derek Sloan on Parliament Hill in June. And for all of these, the college opened up an investigation, the Section 75 investigation is called here in Ontario, and they have charged me with professional misconduct and incompetence for my communications, saying that again, like that statement before, that we're forbidden from saying anything that goes contrary to public health measures, and therefore they've charged me with professional misconduct for all of it.
Okay, and is that what led to the eventual license suspension?
Yes. So all of these things combined, so for speaking, they opened up a number of investigations that kind of all piled on top of each other. Essentially, the charges are on my public speaking, contrary to public health measures. They're charged me with professional misconduct for providing prescriptions for ivermectin, for vitamin D, for zinc, and vitamin C. They have charged me with professional misconduct for providing vaccine exemptions to patients for either medical conditions or for being coerced, so me promoting their autonomy. They've charged me with professional misconduct. I think that's the majority of it, but and there's a lot of side charges as well. As well as reporting all these adverse events. So I have those 9 charges of professional misconduct for each of my adverse event reports.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And I think you indicated some of this was also related to you writing exemptions and so forth? Yeah. Okay. And was that in the context of a family practice?
Yeah, so some of it I did privately, and then some of them I did in the emergency department. I had people coming to me after they saw me speaking publicly. They would come into the emergency department and ask for letters of support or for notes, and I gave that to them, either if they had a medical condition or sometimes for patients who were being coerced against their will, and they were under duress and couldn't give valid consent. And so I gave letters of support in those circumstances.
Okay. And It sounds as though, Dr. Phillips, that when you spoke out about your views with respect to your concerns with the protocols and so forth, were you somewhat under the microscope after that point?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they any interview that I gave on media, every tweet that I've ever made, anything I've ever said, they have recorded and gotten transcripts of to use to prosecute me. One funny story I found about this, I spoke in Toronto at the World Freedom Rally, or I think it was in January, and there's a whole crowd of people there at the rally, and none of them are wearing masks at all, right? Because it's a freedom rally. There's two people there coming in with masks with a microphone and a recorder, and they kind of came right up to me. There's the only two people in the whole place wearing masks, and I later found out in my disclosure that that was the college actually coming to record my speech, and I have the transcript of it from those two people at the rally.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was definitely under the microscope. Yeah.
Okay. Is it fair to say that your actions and your actions throughout the pandemic and your willingness to speak out is directly connected to your desire to protect and protect your pledge to your patients?
Yeah, absolutely. What I'm most concerned about, and as a physician, the way that I've always practiced medicine is that we're there as an advisor. We're there to share our medical knowledge, to help patients make choices about their own health care. And I was so concerned about this change in ethics in the medical community, where coercion is normalized and where doctors participate in coercion, in coercing patients into things. And I found it abhorrent, and that was what mostly led me to want to speak out, to protect the rights of patients, for their wants, their desires, their freedoms to be at the center of the medical system and the doctor-patient relationship. Yes.
Thank you so much for offering your testimony here today, Dr. Phillips. There may be questions from the commissioners, so I'll hold on there. So hold on one moment, there may be questions. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. I just have a few questions following up on some of the things that you've spoken about today. Early in your testimony, you talked about there being a college statement that was issued forbidding doctors from communicating anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-lockdown type positions. Is that something that we have in our evidence as an exhibit? And if not, is that something that we would be able to take a look at?
No, but we may. Would you be able to provide anything like that, Dr. Phillips?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's still on their Twitter feed. It's on their website. They have not taken it down. Yeah, I can send it on to you.
Yeah, thank you. Another thing you mentioned was about some of the early measures that were taken early in the pandemic and the switch from in-person visits with doctors to phone-based appointments. And I'm just wondering if that was a requirement, a recommendation, or what was the impetus for that to happen on such a large scale?
Yeah, it was essentially a requirement put out there. If not, it was like virtually everybody was doing this, and suggestions by the college we now know are requirements. They treat a suggestion as a suggestion, you will be prosecuted. So yeah, that's basically what happened. They did have exceptions where if a child was to get a vaccine, or if somebody, we're supposed to basically talk to them first on the phone, and then if required, you bring them in for a physical examination. So there were still physical examinations happening, but it was drastically reduced, and most doctors were depending on patients to kind of report their physical exam.
Thank you. And the last question I had was around the public health officer investigation that you talked about. And I think you mentioned that it was after you had submitted your first 5 reports that you received a call. Were you not contacted earlier than that as part of the investigation?
No, I thought I would be. I thought they'd call me because, like, I dictate a lot of my reports. So my reports, again, working in Emerge, it's not the same as a family practice where you kind of have an ongoing relationship with a patient. When I work that day, I submit all my reports and paperwork that same time. So a lot of my reports are dictated and they're not kind of fully done yet. So I expected he would contact me back, asking for more information, or asking for my dictated reports from my Emerge visit, and they didn't contact me at all. And even after I requested him to contact me because I was concerned about these rejections.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Based on your assessment of the, I would say, state of the art in terms of evaluating whether a adverse event report is serious or not, what was the protocol that was explained to doctor to guide them to fill out those reports? Did you have access to a specific protocol?
So I didn't know about the protocol until after, but in his letter he sent me the guidance document for what the criteria they use to determine whether something qualifies for an adverse event or not. It is an extensive document, but the number of adverse events they're looking for is it's limited to kind of 1.5 pages. For COVID specifically, it was about 10 adverse events they would look at, and if it didn't fit in that category, it didn't count. But one example I like for how arbitrary a lot of these criteria were, because I'll give you one example. If you administer a vaccine and a patient has syncope, like they faint, it doesn't count at all, unless they also have an injury. So if they faint, hit their head, and have a bleed in their brain, then that does count. But again, even in that circumstance, it only counts if it happens within 30 minutes. If that person faints at 31 minutes and then they fall and have a bleed into their brain, that report will be rejected. So they have very arbitrary, and for each category, they have arbitrary time requirements. And if it doesn't fall within those strict criteria, they're rejected. And these were developed before the COVID vaccines, before the Pfizer data that came out in their post-marketing analysis. They were forced to release under a FOIA request in the United States, showing like pages and pages of adverse events of concern, right? So they had just 10 on this form, when there were hundreds to thousands that Pfizer notified and found were adverse events that we should be monitoring for. So my patients didn't fit in those category of those 10, therefore they were rejected. But we now know that even Pfizer themselves acknowledged a wide array of adverse events that my patients certainly would have been fitting into.
Based on your best assessment again, what would you say about the so-called underreporting factor that in the States has been calibrated or has been assessed in the range of 40 to sometime up to 100? Some people say it's tenfold. What would be your evaluation on that in your practice in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what happened with me, it shows you what happens when you report adverse events. So there's a number of things that happen. One, they often get rejected. So you get pushback from public health themselves. The other one is I got reported to the college, and I'm being prosecuted for reporting these adverse events. Even if my adverse events were wrong, even if they weren't adverse events, how does it make any sense that it's professional misconduct to report them? So that people know that. My case is very public. So I just use that as an example that doctors know there's consequences. So there's consequences on a number of levels, from public health, from the colleges, their licenses at risk for reporting, and within their hospitals as well. So doctors, besides their maybe internal biases, even if they didn't have those biases, their license is at risk from reporting any adverse events.
Couple of questions.
So, yeah, it's definitely underreported. Yeah, to answer the question.
I have a couple of questions about the CAPIS system, and for some people don't even understand what that system is. Is it fair to say it's very similar to the VAERS system in the United States?
No.
No?
No. Well, yeah, no. It's the same idea, right? In that it's vaccine adverse event reporting, but VAERS has problems with its transparency, but it is extremely transparent compared to our Canadian system. So you can go on the VAERS and you can look at those reports. They're just de-identified. You can look at them. Anybody can report to the VAERS system, not just your doctor. You can report it yourself, and they verify them to make sure that the lot numbers line up and the patient, to make sure that they're genuine. But in Canada, it's completely opaque. Nobody knows who's reporting what, and there's multiple levels of censorship. So the doctor can choose not to report, even if the patient asks them to. Then, even if the doctor does report, it goes to the local public health officer, who is the person tasked with promoting the vaccine and forcing people to get the vaccine. That's their role. So they have a major conflict of interest in investigating adverse events. So they have the ability to reject it. And then they send it to Public Health Ontario, who has the ability to amass the information and filter even more out. And then they report it to Health Canada. So there are so many layers for things to get censored, covered up. And I can tell you, I got an email as part of my disclosure for my charges at the college that the public health officer sent on June 11th to the college, saying that my batch of adverse event reports, none of them were my batch of adverse event reports were not submitted to Public Health Ontario. So yeah, none of them, as far as I know, made it into the system to be able to be reported to the safety system.
Did you know prior to submitting those reports, adverse events reports, that they were subject to censor?
No, I did not know that. I didn't know much about the system. I learned it along the way.
Have you had any of your colleagues indicate to you that they were hesitant in reporting to that system, based on your experience?
Yeah. Oh, based on my experience, yeah. When people heard what happened to me, then yes, I've heard from some that said they wouldn't report. I'll mention one more thing that really I found disturbing to me, that influenced that for myself and some other doctors, and that was in that letter. And what I found out about that process is when the public health officer investigates, they decide something is not an adverse event. They called up each and every one of those patients that I saw, told them it was not an adverse event, and told them that they're required to get their next dose. So, and that's documented in paper with every single one of them. That I found very disturbing, because what I started to realize is that I'm actually putting my patients in harm's way by reporting, because they're going to be at risk of being gaslit, in the sense that they're going to be told that this is not an adverse event because it doesn't meet these strict criteria, and therefore they should get another dose of something that could have caused them severe harm. It's malpractice in my mind. If somebody had a reaction to Tylenol, we would put that in their chart and say, don't take Tylenol. Even if we're wrong about it, we want to be cautious and say, okay, look, stay away from Tylenol. If this caused your arm to go numb, don't take another one. But instead, when I report them, they're getting told to take another, and they're told it's not related. I realized at some point it's actually harmful to patients to report these.
Prior to the public health officer essentially making a medical determination with one of your patients, are you aware of two parts of the question? First, did the public health officer in any instance actually bring the patient in for examination before making a recommendation to that patient?
No, they called them up, but there were no physical exams in the documentation that I saw.
Okay. And do you know anything at all, and this perhaps a bit of a stretch of a question, but do you know anything of all about the public health officer's clinical experience in treating patients?
So in my area, he actually does. So he's a part-time family and emergency doctor, and then part-time does the public health office. I think in the majority of places that are more populated, it's a full-time job. But yeah, in my case, he does have clinical experience.
Okay. And my last question on this is there any practical suggestions that you might make for the future in order to improve this system, the CAFIS system?
Yeah, so there's a number of them. So I think we need to follow the VAERS system, where any reports that go into that system need to be available to the public with removal of identifying information. There should be a verification process, but it should be more around the details, right? The name, age, date of birth, the lot numbers, to make sure it's a genuine report, but then don't censor it or keep it hidden. There needs to be a division of powers when it comes to investigating adverse events from vaccines and promoting vaccines. That's a major conflict of interest for the public health officer to be tasked with those same things. If you're pushing these vaccines on everybody, you're not going to want to see adverse events, right? You're not going to want to believe that you're pushing something that might be harmful to people. So you're going to be more likely to discount those adverse events. So yeah, I think it needs to be transparent, and so they're submitted right away. The public need to be able to submit them as well. If their doctor doesn't want to report it, the patient should be able to report as well. And we need cutoff criteria. After how many deaths are we going to tolerate before we pull something off the market? They pulled off like treadmills after like 4 people just got injured, no deaths at all. It's pulled off the market immediately. Breast milk, I think one baby died from baby formula. They pull it off the market immediately. At this point, there's tens of thousands of deaths, credible reports of deaths reported to the VAERS system, and it's still on the market. Not only on the market, but being forced on people. It's an atrocity, honestly. But we need that criteria. We need to be like, after how many deaths? I would say 5 credible reports of death. Pull something off. Like, we should not be giving this to the public. Maybe even 5 is too many. But right now, what's the point in reporting when we're like the criteria is already met? These things are deadly. They're dangerous. They kill people, including my own cousin. Autopsy confirmed, and they're dangerous. Like, so the reporting system's useless unless you're going to act on it. So we need to have laws in place that after a certain criteria, a product needs to be pulled off the market to protect public safety.
Thank you.
A quick question. Is it normal historically for pharmacists to report physicians when they prescribe medications for their patients?
That's not normal. I've never experienced that before. Pharmacists do have a role to verify things and double check things, right? Because sometimes doctors do make mistakes, and that's legitimate. But in all of those circumstances, they call back the doctor and they ask you to clarify: is this what you meant to prescribe? Is this the right dose? And they'll often catch things. But I've never seen where they go directly. They don't even call you, and they directly report a prescription to the College of Physicians. That's new, I think. It's a snitch culture that's kind of developed over the course of COVID. And it happened not just with the pharmacists for prescriptions for ivermectin, but it also happened with vaccine exemptions. So if you filled out an exemption, a good chunk of the exemptions that I filled out were sent to the college from employers as well. So yeah, I think it's a cultural thing that's happened. It was seen in totalitarian regimes like Russia and Germany, and it's part of the totalitarian experience.
My last question is, if you had to do this all over again, would you do anything different?
Yeah, I would. There's a few things that I would have done differently. Essentially, no. Like on all these things, reporting adverse events or other things. Maybe looking back now, seeing those patients got called and told to get another shot, maybe I wouldn't have reported them as much, or I would have stopped earlier. I would have still told the patients, like, look, don't get this. But essentially, no. I think I made the decision that according to my conscience at the right time, and I learned so much along the way. So of course there's always things you would have done differently if you went forward, but as far as providing treatment with ivermectin, providing exemptions to people who are being coerced against their will into gene therapy, for reporting adverse events, and for speaking out to give people the other side of the story, the facts, the scientific facts, the harms from lockdowns and other things, I would totally do that again, even knowing I would lose my license.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips.
Thank you.
We wish you luck and speed with the resolution of your claim with the college.
Thank you.
Just two announcements. I misspoke earlier when I said that Christiane Grebe, the 5th commissioner, is a practicing lawyer in Alberta. She is not actually a practicing lawyer. She is an academic, and she researches the history of. So, having corrected that, near the back, I think, suggested during break time, suggested that the audience might be interested in writing down questions for the consideration of commissioners to the commissioners toward the end of the questioning of a witness. A pad and a pencil or